Hello, everyone, and either welcome or welcome back to the Libertarian Podcast. If you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and Libertarian Institute. So for this episode, I sat down to have a chat with Jeremiah Johnson. Jeremiah is a director over at the Neoliberal Project and hosts the Neoliberal Podcast. And we talk about, first off, what exactly is a neoliberal nowadays, and also the intersections of where neoliberalism and libertarianism match up and also where they diverge, and how we could kind of help each other out in different ways, and how maybe we're not the same, but at least adjacent enough to where we can maybe consider each other fellow travelers. So without too much further talking, let's go ahead and get into my conversation with Jeremiah. So today I'm talking to Jeremiah Johnson from the Neoliberal Project, and I wanted to talk to Jeremiah and somebody from the Neoliberal Project in general because I feel like there is kind of this a little bit of synergy. We're not the same, but we're kind of similar. But what I want to start with, because what the world needs now, or at least what political Twitter needs now, is an actual functional definition, working idea of the term neoliberal. So, Jeremiah, go for it. Explain what a neoliberal actually is.
That's the question, right? So, neoliberal is definitely one of those terms that has had a number of definitions throughout the years, and attempting to kind of stake a ground where you're saying this is the definitive definition, this is the one true definition, is almost like starting a fight in a sense. But I'll give it a shot. So there's a lot of ways that I've kind of defined neoliberalism when I have these conversations before. I like to say that if you can think of, 2 or 3 areas of the economy that we should get the government out of, but also 2 or 3 areas of the economy where government intervention is appropriate, you might be a neoliberal. So essentially, I see neoliberalism as the inheritor of kind of the classical liberal tradition that modifies liberalism to say it modifies liberalism from that classical liberalism that really was extremely laissez-faire to say that, we still believe in the foundational liberal principles of a free market economy, the liberal values like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, of association, of the press, so on and so forth. But it recognizes that, sometimes the government also has a role to play within the economy. A free market economy is good, but regulations can be helpful to that. Redistribution of wealth can be helpful to that. They're not necessarily at odds with a functioning market all the time. So that's generally how I would define it, especially for a crowd that leans more libertarian. I would kind of highlight that, neoliberalism and libertarianism come from the same tree. They're definitely cousins. They're both offshoots of classical liberalism, but libertarians kind of kept more of the original idea of laissez-faire economics, where government intervention is almost always viewed with suspicion, whereas neoliberals are softer on that and believe the government can do a lot of good in the economy without, turning the state into a gigantic socialist machine while still keeping the strong parts of market economics.
So kind of like if a modern progressive and a modern libertarian had a baby, that baby would be a neoliberal.
Essentially, yeah. You see a lot of people who are trying to navigate the current political world and find their own definition of what this is. But you also see a lot of people who are basically championing the same idea, coming up with like 20 different terms for the one idea. So you'll see people call themselves left libertarians, like libertarians who want a strong welfare state, but are pretty libertarian otherwise in terms of regulation. Or you'll see like, the never Trump Republicans and the people who've dropped out of the GOP are, coming up with all sorts of ways to describe themselves. The Niskanen Center in in Washington, D.C., was formerly a libertarian think tank, and now they've kind of described themselves as post-libertarian, and they don't like the libertarian angle anymore, and essentially they're neoliberal. But everybody's kind of trying to figure out their own way to describe it, their own name for it.
Yeah, and that whole pivot was a source of much laughter in the libertarian community, I must say. But I would say, especially on the point of left libertarians, that I think neoliberal might actually fit them a little better than the libertarian tag. But the whole idea of neoliberal and neoliberalism is like we joke that libertarian gets thrown around a lot and libertarianism gets thrown around a lot by people who don't understand what it means. But people also do the same thing with the neoliberal tag, and it almost seems even more vague and nebulous when people do it with the neoliberal tag, because it's almost like normally when people throw out the libertarian tag or they tag something as libertarian, when you're doing it and you're not a libertarian, it's normally like a derogative sort of thing. But it seems to me when people throw out the neoliberal tag, it's just kind of this nebulous thing that almost doesn't even have a meaning for people who say the word. And it's like when you label something, oh, that's a neoliberal idea or a neoliberal project, it's like, well, what do you mean by that? And it's like, and that's why I wanted to start with like making something of a functional definition of the term neoliberal. So going forward, like, when someone uses that term, we can have an idea of what is your baseline. It's like, it's one of those terms that people just throw out a lot, and and a lot of people do mean it in a derogatory fashion too, the same way they do libertarian, but it's almost even more vague than when they do it to us.
Yeah, the political economy of using that word has a really interesting history, because the first usage was around the time of the Mont Pelerin Society and the Walter Lippmann Colloque. And those were kind of these conferences of academics back in the 1930s and 1940s when, they were very worried about the history of the future of liberalism. They were all a bunch of classical liberals of various different stripes. And they lived in a world that literally was being overrun by Nazi fascism and, Stalinist communism. And it very much was in doubt whether like this project of international political liberalism was going to work out. Liberal democracy was in danger. And they kind of convened and thought about, we need a reinvigorated liberalism, a new liberalism, and that's literally how they got the term neoliberalism. So for them, it was a self-identifier, but this was a very small conference of academics, and they, had their conferences and they talked among themselves and then departed and went out into the world. And they did manage to influence a lot of people. They were very successful in influencing many different government policies, especially in the Western world. And eventually, the term itself kind of dies within the self-identified neoliberal sphere. But who picks it up in the 70s and the 80s is essentially leftist academics. Within academia, you get this tradition in the 70s and 80s of kind of identifying something you don't like within society and calling it neoliberalism. This is the neoliberal state. This is the neoliberal market kind of controlling the blah, blah, blah. And essentially it became a term that only leftists use, and almost always specifically like academic leftists, historians, or, sociologists, those kind of things. And so it was very much for several decades only a term that was derogatory. Nobody would have self-described that for 30 or 40 years. And it was only derogatory. And essentially, most of the time, it was actually confused with libertarianism. The leftists meant neoliberal as kind of worship of the market, unthinking, unfeeling devotion to capitalism, and all government is bad. Cut every program, cut every tax, cut. So it's kind of interesting that that's the case, because neoliberalism was, I would say, kind of caricatured as libertarianism, or as like not even libertarianism, but like a fundamentalist style of libertarianism. So that kind of linkage is interesting. And it's only been in the past say, 5 years that anyone has started to self-identify as neoliberal again.
Yeah, and I would say even today, I do think a lot of people conflate neoliberal with libertarian with classic liberal and thinking it's all the same thing. And there's a lot of overlap, don't get me wrong, but we're not the same thing. Like, if I were to try to map this onto libertarianism, maybe big L libertarianism would be neoliberal, but not entirely either. But you do make the point, and this is something that obviously anybody who follows politics notices, especially after the 2016 election, and especially how the left/progressive movement has lurched so far left now that neoliberal is this like insult, and it's considered to be this awful, horrible, no good thing when you look at what it is that neoliberals propose, it's really a hell of a lot closer to what was the post-Cold War consensus of how we as a globe move forward together as far as, free trade, deregulation, kind of being much more socially liberal. And it's odd that I think both neoliberals and libertarians kind of find themselves in this very odd place of being sort of thrust out of our original homes, both neoliberals on the left and libertarians on the right, and kind of becoming these pariahs. And it's a very weird place to be, where we used to be what would be considered somewhat normal, but now I don't know. Like, I don't really know where we stand anymore with anybody. It's a very weird time to live in.
Yeah, if you're in the Democratic Party, I mean, the only two Democrats who have won a presidential election in the last 40 years are, have been described as neoliberal. Clinton and Obama is it.
Yeah.
So, this is the type of politician who would typically be associated with neoliberalism. Is sometimes when you're in the 80s and those academics started using the term, they would describe Reagan and Thatcher as neoliberals. In the 90s, you started to get like the shift on left-leaning parties in the Western Hemisphere. So you saw like Labor kind of shifted from a socialist model to the Tony Blair, new labor model, where they embraced market economics and, they kind of dropped a lot of the socialism aspects. And the Democratic Party kind of became the Clintonite party rather than a more progressive party. And both of those parties had a lot of electoral success with that strategy. Obama in 2008 obviously ran as kind of a mega progressive, but governed in a pretty centrist way, I would say. So it is interesting. The Democratic Party has definitely shifted to the left. And the other shift that's happened that you mentioned that I think is an important unifying factor for a lot of libertarians and neoliberals is the right's shift towards kind of isolationism and nationalism. And, one of the core aspects that I didn't touch on in kind of that original definition is that I think there's not a lot of like litmus tests you have to pass to be a neoliberal, but one that I would probably apply is being a globalist, being a free trade advocate in most instances, being for, immigration, certainly increased immigration in the United States compared to what we have now, but generally seeing immigration as a good, positive thing, understanding the value of international institutions and kind of a more connected world. That's pretty core to the neoliberal worldview. And I think for a lot of libertarians, it's also pretty core. I don't know that that's universal, because there is unfortunately kind of a nationalist strain sometimes within libertarian thought, and maybe we can get into this. Sometimes there's been a libertarian to alt-right pipeline where it's not the majority of libertarians, but that pipeline does seem to exist sometimes. But for the majority of libertarians and neoliberals, I think that globalist view is something that would generally be pretty unifying.
Yeah, and I am definitely of the wing of being very pro-globalist, very pro-immigrant, very pro-free trade. The libertarian to alt-right pipeline is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, kind of kicking around show notes for future content. Everybody, show notes for future content. But I also, there is kind of like that knee-jerk reaction to pointing that out that I personally don't have, but other libertarians do. And I don't really understand why that is. But again, we can get into that later if we have time. Or
that's just a tribal thing. You know, nobody likes to admit fault with their own side, even if the fault is real, just because it feels like acknowledging an imperfection in your own side is like admitting that the other guys are going to win or something, like letting them score points on you. It's tribal politics, basically, which it's not a specifically libertarian or left or right thing. It's just nobody likes to give the other side a win.
True, but I do think that if you want to get better as a party or as an ideology or as even just at messaging, you kind of have to look at the bad stuff and kind of grapple with that. But to bring it back to something you were talking about earlier, especially as far as like Clintonite policy and everything and how far afield we've gotten from that, like look at poor John Delaney. Poor John Delaney's out here saying very sensible things and he gets slammed every freaking time. And it's just like, what the hell has happened? Like, oh my God, this poor man. But it's just, it's staggering to look at how far to the edges both parties have gone. And it's leaving this vast swath of people in the middle that I think that either both or either neoliberalism or libertarianism could be appealing to. And so I think that maybe I know our message is not the hot, super sexy message that gets people all fired up and gets people all of the money and all of the fame and all of the things, but I do think there is value in trying to create something a little more durable and a little more welcoming to those people who are starting to feel increasingly isolated from both parties.
Yeah, it's funny. We had John Delaney on our podcast, and I'm in general a big fan of his, not of every policy, but I think he's overall would make a great president. It's just to highlight how much the Democratic Party has shifted. I think it's pretty clear that even someone like Joe Biden, if Joe Biden is elected, would be by far the most progressive president we've ever had. In terms of cold policy advocacy, he would absolutely be more progressive than any president in history. He wants to go expand the ACA further than Obama did. He wants to increase the minimum wage. He wants a lot of different stuff. And, you know, he would be the most progressive president. Maybe not by a lot over Obama, but I think it's pretty clear.
And yet he's considered
he's the most moderate. Yeah, he's the most moderate guy in the field.
Yeah, he's considered like a centrist hack. And it's like, I don't even know what to say to you people anymore. It's like, I'm baffled. Like, I mean, if both parties want to run themselves off of a cliff, be my guest. Via con Dios, please leave, go, bye. Your time has come and gone. Go away. But yeah, and I had actually made a point on Twitter the other day that in another life, in another universe, that Delaney would actually be like a top tier centrist candidate that would have broad appeal to the country, but apparently we don't do that anymore. I don't know. But to kind of bring it back to the original discussion, there are a lot of places where neoliberalism and libertarianism do actually intersect, especially on policies such as trade and immigration, and even domestic policies such as like housing and public transit and kind of like social policy issues that I think there is a lot of overlap between the two. So I wanted to kind of throw that to you and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's one of the areas where neoliberals are definitely in favor of kind of reducing government intervention in the economy. Like I said, in certain instances, I think that markets need kind of the government to step back. And in certain instances, I think that the government can actually help markets function better. But when you talk about like housing, it's pretty clear that the housing issues we have are just that we don't build enough housing. Like, full stop, we do not have enough houses in the places people want to live. I live in New York City, which has one of the worst housing markets in America. It's not the worst, but it's probably in the top 10. And, you know, something like 50 to 75,000 people move into New York every year. If you just look at like population change between 2010 and now, just call it 50,000 people a year. And we do not build like 50,000 new units a year, or even, you know, 20,000 new units a year. It's much less than that. I think I'd have to go look it up again, but I think it's more on the order of like 10,000 units a year New York City adds, because the zoning laws are so restrictive that it's very difficult to build. The process takes forever. And there's just so much that goes into it that it functionally is extremely, extremely difficult to get anything built. And if what you end up having is, you know, you can't stop people from wanting to be here. And so you have lots of people moving in. You have not enough housing being built. And so the price goes up. And, you know, there's no way to get around the simple supply and demand of it. You know, in a lot of cases, I like to say, well, actually, the story is really nuanced. And, you know, just, you know, one simple explanation doesn't really do the situation justice. But housing is really a pretty simple story. You can add a little bit of depth to it, but you can't get around that you need more housing in most big cities. And making it easier to do that, you know, lessening the regulatory burden to do it and making it simply permissible to build denser housing would really, really help the problem. One of the favorite things that I like to do to illustrate this problem is like look at a picture of San Francisco. And San Francisco is supposed to be one of like the densest cities in the United States. And I think it is actually in terms of within the city limits, what the population per square mile is. But if you actually look at an aerial view of San Francisco, you've got the downtown, which is extremely, extremely dense. And then like 70 to 80% of the city is still single family housing. And it's zoned so that it can only be single family housing. Detached houses with driveways and front yards and backyards. And this is within the city limits of San Francisco, just like endless single family housing. And it's essentially illegal to make San Francisco any denser in those areas, despite the fact that it could be very easily done. So that's something where I think neoliberals and libertarians would intersect. There's also areas like the regulation of certain jobs, certain employment situations. We like to make a lot of fun of states that do things like require 1,500 hours to become like a cosmetologist, which is, you know, like more training than you would generally need to become an EMT. People are out there licensing barbers where you need, you know, 2,000 hours of experience. There's even some states do stuff like they regulate hair braiding. They regulate interior design or florists or things like that. The amount of Americans who work with a kind of license to work under some sort of regulatory scheme was like 3% decades ago, and it's up to about 25% now. And I'd love to get that number way back down and see, you know, a lot fewer people, you know, needing that kind of regulation. And a lot of people kind of yell about this like, oh, you know, you want to see unlicensed dentists running around and unlicensed doctors and things like that. And it doesn't go that far. But like, I think like the hair braiders probably just don't need licensing. And that barbers could probably make do with like a couple hundred hours of training rather than like 1,500 or 2,000 hours of training.
Yeah, I think that both neoliberals and libertarians can agree that NIMBYs and people that love licensing make us both very, very stabby. But to go back to kind of a point that I wanted to make about especially housing regulation and NIMBYs and the Bay Area and why it all sucks, it kind of, you end up with this dual dual situation, and especially you get this in New York too, where if you make it difficult to build housing and you make it expensive to build housing, and you see this obviously more in New York City than you do in San Francisco, but if the land that you have is very, very finite, then what you're going to get is a very small amount of housing being built, but it's also going to be catered towards a more luxury market because you need that return on investment. Like, if you make it prohibitively expensive to build affordable housing, then affordable housing is not going to get built.
Yeah, and a lot of this, there's different things that happen in different cities. It's not always the same problem. So in somewhere like San Francisco, one of the key problems is that the review process is so burdensome and so long that essentially you can never get anything built. There's a guy who's been trying to build an 8-story condominium tower, and I say tower, it's 8 stories tall, I think. It's like 40 units or 50 or 60 units. It's not like a mega building.
Yeah.
But he has essentially been trying to build this for 5 or 6 years. I don't know. It's multiple years, at least 3 years at this point. And the first situation that delayed him for almost a year and a half was that the building he was trying to tear down was a historic laundromat. So the laundromat has too much history. Nobody knows why, but somebody claimed it, and it literally delayed the process by about a year. And then they went to another round of hearings, and the new claim was that this building is going to cast a shadow on the park. On 15% of the local park for 3 hours a day, it would cast a shadow. And so literally there's been another round of hearings for a year on this. And in San Francisco, that's the problem. In other cities like LA, it's more of a regulatory problem where LA makes so much parking mandatory for each housing unit. Every time you build a housing unit, you have to have parking spaces for it. And that basically increased the cost of doing everything by, I don't know, a factor of 2. You have to buy more land. If you're not buying more land, you have to essentially build a parking deck, and there's, you have to build the building in a certain way such that it it makes sense to have a garden rooftop because you get eco points for that, and they let you do more stuff. But if you have a garden rooftop, that means the whole building has to be able to hold more weight, and you have to use a different type of frame for the building, which increases the cost of it just turns into this thing. So in different cities, there's all sorts of different rules. Every city is kind of screwed up in their own local way sometimes.
Yeah, like here in Atlanta, our problem is public transportation. We have, I think the last stat I saw was we have about 1 million people per year moving into the Atlanta metro area. And what I'm starting to see, especially in the area where I live, is we're starting to kind of sort of reach build out, at least inside the perimeter. I mean, outside the perimeter is a whole nother ball of wax. So we're starting to get more apartment complexes being built around where I live, and they're building up instead of out because out isn't really an option anymore. But the flip side to that is this is also very expensive housing. Relatively speaking, it's expensive for the market. It's not expensive relative to what you would pay, say, in New York City for a 2-2. Here,
yeah.
A brand new 2-2, you'd be looking anywhere probably $1,750 to $2,000 a month. Which for New York would be insanely freaking cheap. But the problem we have is once you start getting out into the suburbs, and our public transit situation is fucking horrifyingly bad. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But we're starting to creep into, in Atlanta, into the super commuter status where people spend more than 2 hours a day in their car getting to and from work. And so you're starting to get this sprawl further and further and further out.
Yeah, my sense of Atlanta has always been that they build enough housing, but that very little of it is, or at least not enough of it is centralized, that most of the building in Atlanta takes place in the suburban ring.
Yeah, and I moved up here 14 years ago, and parts that were considered BFE when I moved up here are now the outer suburbs.
Mm-hmm, yep.
And it all kind of comes down to you have to have a car in Atlanta. Like, I wish it was not that way. I'm a big fan of public transportation. We don't have it here. And so that is something that's going to start creating more and more of a problem the more and more people that move in here.
That's an interesting libertarian position to take. Give me the libertarian case for great public transit systems.
I like public transit. If I had to bring this down to like a libertarian level and not just my own personal likes and dislikes, it's, to me, and everybody keeps posting up, and I'm so mad I missed this by like a couple of weeks, because I was up in New York about a month ago. And then, what was it, like a couple of weeks ago, they took 14th Street and banned cars off of it.
That was literally a week ago from this recording, I think.
Oh my God. I just missed it, and I'm so mad. But now I see these clips of just like buses doing 45 miles an hour down 14th Street, and there's no traffic, and it's just like borderline pornographic. But it's one of those things, and whether you believe in climate change or not, or whatever, doesn't matter. Road congestion sucks. Like, it sucks that people have to like spend all this time in their cars getting to and from work. And while, especially, I mean, you live in New York, the joke about the subways is always present and always there, that somebody should fix the subways. So,
which is funny, because New York has essentially the only good subway system in America.
Yeah,
it's not perfect, but
it's not that bad.
Subway's functional. Yeah, I think there's kind of a libertarian approach to the use of the streets, where you could be like, well, why should anybody restrict cars from going where they want? It's an issue of personal freedom. Don't tell me where I can drive and I can't drive. But you also have to remember that streets are public space. This is owned by the government, and this is very public space in the way that, someone on the left would describe a public space. It is a social space that is for the community, essentially. Nobody owns that space in almost any instance, especially in the middle of cities. Nobody can claim to own the center of a street other than a state. So the decision to have that dominated by cars is it's a choice. And for most of the last 50, 60 years, it's been an unconscious choice. We just assume that, well, streets have to be dominated by cars, don't they? But, in cities for thousands of years before that, the space in between buildings was a pedestrian zone. It was a space where people could walk, children could play without fear of being gunned down by a pickup truck, run over. And it's a very conscious decision to have the state enforce the idea that that is a space for cars and nothing else. And I think the movement back towards this is a space for pedestrians, or this is a space for public transit, this is not a space for cars, I think that would be immensely beneficial for society in just a number of ways.
Or at least to make it a viable choice between A or B, because for most cities, it's really not. Like, you pretty much have to have a car. I mean, the amount of cities that have like an actual robust public transportation system are really, really small. And that kind of sucks, because, I mean, if public transportation was more feasible for me, I would use it, but it's not. So I have my car, and I am one of those very, very lucky, fortunate people in Atlanta to have somewhat affordable housing within a very close range to my office. So I don't have the commute, and I do that for a reason. But yeah, and it's not necessarily that public transportation has to be a solely publicly funded thing. I mean, you could do maybe like, if you had to, a public-private sort of like collaboration, or if we could figure out a way to do it completely privately. This is actually a conversation I was having when I was up in New York over dinner with a bunch of people about how one would even begin to privatize the New York subway system, and how one would begin to make it better than it is now. And that is an incredibly difficult conversation. I'm not going to pretend like it's not. But yeah.
Well, there's models to follow. So, one way to do this is to look internationally and to see what other countries do that work. You can kind of do cross-country comparisons, and it says, it doesn't prove anything in a scientific sense, but it does kind of waggle its eyebrows and point over there, look over there. So you can look at a place like London, where, the tube in London is better than any American subway system, and I'm sure the Londoners complain about the tube, but it's pretty great from an international perspective. And they should be proud of it. And it is entirely state-run, entirely state-managed, totally nationalized. But you've also got cities like Tokyo, where Tokyo probably has the greatest subway system in the world. Their subway system is immaculate and clean and on time to the second, to the point where, if a train leaves 20 seconds early, they will issue an apology. And I'm not joking about that. They have literally issued apologies for trains leaving too early by 30 seconds. But Tokyo's subway system is a weird mixture of private lines and public lines and kind of public-private partnerships. And so I think there's multiple models that can work. I'm not ideological about how this stuff gets done, but yeah, so that's my spiel on public transit. I think there's a lot of models that work.
Yeah, and I think Tokyo is a good kind of case study for a lot of different things, including housing and just density management, because obviously Tokyo is an insanely dense city, but they seem to manage it. And I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of different sort of ways that you could handle that. But I want to move on from that and kind of talk about how both neoliberals and libertarians, kind of because of our non-extreme beliefs, end up kind of being punching bags for our respective sides. Being libertarians end up being the punching bags for the right, and somehow neoliberals end up being the punching bags for the left.
That's an interesting way to phrase it. Would you say that libertarians have a non-extreme set of beliefs? Because you could make that case, but I'd imagine that there are also people who would make the case that libertarianism is an extreme belief set.
Well, let me back that up and rephrase that. Not extreme in the way that both the Democrat and Republican Party seem to be going to extremes and leaving this very broad center where I feel like both libertarians and neoliberals kind of fill in that void that's being left, and somehow not that our views have changed, but that we are kind of becoming the center by default.
I mean, I'm not sure, because the center is a weird term. The center does shift around, right? And if you stick to a single set of principles, then by definition you might start in one area of the political spectrum and end in another. If you took somebody from 1960 who is pretty socially liberal today, or in 1960, and kind of put them into today's culture, they would be socially regressive. So there is kind of a place for shifting values. I would never say that, sticking to your guns in all circumstances is a good thing always, because society changes, right? And policy should change as society changes. But that doesn't mean that, obviously, that values should mean nothing and that you should kind of just change every view you have because the political winds change. So there's kind of an interesting dynamic there between sticking to your guns as far as what you believe, but also, adjusting to the times and not being that guy who's still got views from like the 1900s, where that are just really, really outdated. It kind of makes me laugh when people say that they're classical liberals rather than some sort of more contemporary definition, because classical liberalism had just a bunch of weird stuff going on. You actually read all of the classical liberals and there's a bunch of stuff in there I'm pretty sure you wouldn't want to be associated with. So just update your terminology a little bit.
Yeah, and I think classical liberal is kind of gotten bastardized to the point where it certainly doesn't mean what it meant 5 years ago, and I'm not entirely sure what that means anymore either when people use it as a descriptor.
Honestly, classical liberal is something that the alt-right calls themselves. If we're talking about functionally, most people who say classical liberal are doing it as weasel words for something that is very much anti-liberal, I would say.
Yeah, and there are people that use the term libertarian in that way too, which irritates me no end, because then we have to deal with the aftermath of that. Yeah, that's that is most definitely an ongoing problem, at least in my mind, with the term libertarian and libertarianism, to the point where some people don't, while they may agree with the general tenets of libertarianism, they don't want to use the word. And that, I think, is a problem. And I'm not that there's like a neoliberal to alt-right pipeline, but I'm kind of hoping that the idea of neoliberalism and using that as a descriptive term for oneself doesn't end up in that same sort of area. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we emphasize not just economic issues, but the kind of what I would call the social justice side of things like immigration, that it leads to a more socially just world if people are not, sentenced to poverty by nature of where they were born. Because, that's essentially the case. If you're born in Haiti, it doesn't matter how much personal gumption and talent you have. There's very little that you can do to improve yourself out of your station. The institutions for economic growth are not there. And, you can't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps because you're in Haiti. Essentially, every Haitian who's ever, pulled themselves out of poverty has done so by immigrating out of Haiti. And that's a really unfortunate fact. But that, closing the border to Haitians in this example, I think is an extremely anti-social justice move. And when I pitch this to people on the left, that's some of the phrasing that I use. I try not to talk solely about economics, but also about the social justice ramifications of something like that. And I think that hopefully kind of immunizes us from the alt-right pipeline. I don't want anybody associated with that within 100 miles of this movement.
Yeah, and I think just by the tenets of what neoliberalism is, I don't think that necessarily is going to be a problem for you guys, but I do kind of see it where people get the neoliberal tag put on them. They're like, well, no, I'm not quite that. It's like, well, there's nothing wrong with being that. It always gets associated with these 2 or 3 kind of things that you don't agree with, and then all of a sudden, well, I'm not that. And it's kind of a weird place to be, and I kind of hope you guys don't ever end up there, but especially on immigration, and this is definitely a third rail in libertarianism. I will freely admit that, and I will freely admit I am an Ellis Island girl. I would rather there be just super duper limited, very light vetting. Okay, do you have a criminal background? Do you have any communicable illnesses? No? Okay, cool. Welcome to America. But one of the things that just makes me scream every time somebody says it in relation to immigration, and to bring it back to your point about Haitians and being in Haiti, is people who want to say, well, why don't they stay in their own country and make it better? It's like, really? Do you think they didn't think of that? Do you think that you just came up with a new idea just all by yourself right now? It's like there's this weird acknowledgement, or lack thereof, that not every place is here, and that some places are indeed actually shittier than here, and that's why those people want to leave there and come here.
Yep, totally agree.
Yeah, and that's one of those where, again, neoliberals and libertarians can agree. And I think really the schism would be in how much government involvement there should be in certain areas. And even within libertarianism, you will have, there's a gradient. There are people who are more big L libertarians. You have people who are more small L. You have minarchists. You have anarchists. And that is something that I think gets lost a lot when people who aren't really in the libertarian movement or really paying attention don't realize that is like, there are shades here. Like, there are different places. Like, not everybody is an anarchist. Some people are minarchists. Some people do feel like there is a role for government to play, albeit various shades of limited depending on your personal beliefs as to what their role in place is. And so that's where I think that there is a lot of overlap with neoliberalism.
Yeah, and I think that neoliberals would share respect for the market with libertarians, but would definitely disagree on certain instances where, neoliberals are broadly in favor of many government interventions into the economy. The way I would make that case to a libertarian crowd is that sometimes government action can actually be pro-market. Markets are not magical things that kind of just pop out of existence into nowhere. They're very much socially created institutions. And you can see that in various cultures throughout history, that markets don't just spontaneously exist. They're created by the cultures and kind of developed over time, and they exist within a framework of, here's a set of laws around how people should interact with each other. Here's a set of cultural norms around how they interact with each other. And so we have to create markets, and how we create them is a choice. And part of that is the role of the government and the role of the legal structure. So, there are instances where markets fail. Like a classic example is like pollution externalities, where unregulated market economics would say just let things go. But in the end, that leads to something like pollution, where everybody's paying the cost and you end up with highly negative outcomes. In that case, a regulation that kind of restricts the ability of someone to pollute is actually a pro-market move, because it is kind of helping the market to function in a more normal way than it would have normally, than it would have in its previous existence. There's other instances, where like one company has way too much power, there's a monopoly situation, or, one company has hiring power, what you'd call monopsony, or there's just not enough competition in the market. There's a lot of ways in which the market by itself can lead to inefficient outcomes. And, you can study all of this if you study economics, and the government can actually make very pro-market moves to help the market kind of work the way that it should. So that's it for a libertarian crowd. That's generally how I would kind of make the neoliberal case for regulatory intervention, that the goal is to have markets working in the most optimal way that they can, and leaving them alone is kind of a social choice that isn't actually always the best way to do that.
And that is going to be a very hard pitch to make to libertarians, because I can already tell you that the pushback on that's going to be that the reason why a lot of the things are the way they are in our market is because of government and because of crony capitalism. And if we got rid of a lot of that, then that would free up markets to actually behave in the ways that they would behave naturally without any kind of intervention. But again, that's kind of the split between neoliberals and libertarians that, it exists, and that's fine. And if the day ever came where it was just libertarians and neoliberals arguing it out for how the country's going to be run, I would take that over and beyond what we have right now, because we do have overlap, and I do kind of ascribe to the 80-20 rule, and I do think that neoliberals and libertarians could agree on 80% of things. It's just going to be that 20% that's going to get really contentious.
Agreed. Yeah, and the libertarian instinct, I think, is a valuable one, in that there's an instinct that most libertarians have that says, you should be really careful how how these regulations might backfire, that the state getting involved with good intentions is not proof that it's actually going to make things better. That's a really valuable instinct to have. But I think there's also a valuable instinct on the other side that, trusting markets implicitly can also lead to poor outcomes sometimes. And I personally take a pretty kind of consequentialist approach to this. I'm interested in what leads to the best outcomes. And to me, that's essentially a mixed economy. There's a lot of areas in the economy that are complicated enough that various market failures exist. And some of them can be explained by, regulatory capture or crony capitalism. But some of them are just market failures. And, the government should step in from a neoliberal perspective.
And that's fair enough. And like I said, if the day ever came where we got to argue that out, absent everybody else who wants to pull things to these polarities, I would be A-okay with that, because and you're going to get different libertarians thinking differently on this, because people are more or less strident about certain things than others, and that's kind of part and parcel of libertarianism too. Everybody kind of has their thing that they are very strongly, passionately opinionated about. But I do think that neoliberalism, if we were to take things from where they are now to where I personally would like them to be, neoliberalism would definitely be like one of the stations that the train would have to stop at before we got to the final destination that I would want. And I'm also sensitive to the fact that not everybody would be entirely comfortable with my personal utopia. I mean, I am an anarchist on a good day and a minarchist on a bad day. But I understand that not everybody is super comfortable with the idea of doing away with government or making it super duper extra tiny, very small. And that in that there is a place for neoliberalism, maybe not in the libertarian tent, but maybe you guys can set up your tent next to our tent.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that, like I said, I think the libertarian instinct is valuable. I do think we definitely are going to have areas of disagreement where there's just going to be a clash of values. If you come from kind of the anarcho-capitalist tradition, then there's essentially we're beyond asking consequentialist questions most of the time. And my impression has been that most anarcho-capitalists kind of take a moral position that the state is kind of illegitimate. But I don't know if that is the case for you personally, but a lot of times you end up in a more of just a moral question of, does the state have a right to exist? Is the state inherently illegitimate or inherently immoral? Is the non-aggression principle something that should be universally recognized, or does the state have the right to use aggression in some instances? Those are all kind of moral questions rather than, consequentialist questions about outcomes. So I don't know if that's how you approach it personally, or if whether you take kind of a moral stance on this, or, just you're trying to get the best outcomes, and this is how you think that would be accomplished.
I personally kind of separate morality from pragmatism a lot. Like, I have my personal beliefs, but I also understand that things have to get done. And so maybe a more consequentialist approach, like what you're saying, is needed sometimes, because you have to think pragmatically when you're trying to come up with like actual policy positions, or you're trying to craft legislation, or you're trying to affect some kind of change. You have to think about how this would work out logistically. You have to think about how people would react to this logistically. And I think that is kind of a blind spot that a lot of libertarians have, because we are very philosophically inclined, and some people to the point where pragmatism goes out the window. And I don't agree with that, because I think that there are libertarians that view being a libertarian and libertarianism as more like not necessarily a thought experiment, but more of a philosophical sort of idea. And I am much more pragmatic. Like, I want to see this put into practice. So I tend to think about what that's going to look like.
One of the alluring things about libertarianism is that it's a, mostly self-consistent kind of train of thought that, within the bubble of libertarianism, I would say it's like 95% self-consistent, that you really only need like one or two moral principles, and it creates this whole system out of those one or two principles. And it's very appealing to a lot of people who like to break things down into their, integral parts. And the reason I kind of eventually drifted away from libertarianism, because I flirted with it at one point, but I think the world is generally more complicated than libertarians give it credit for. And those complications just lead to messiness everywhere, where kind of those clean, self-consistent systems don't actually describe a lot of reality. Reality is so multifaceted and overlapped with culture and, various market forces pushing you in 100 directions at once, and, personal biases and irrationality and all sorts of stuff that essentially makes any kind of first or second level analysis is going to fail because of how complicated the world is. And that's where you step in and you say, well, we're just going to have to clutch together a bunch of imperfect solutions, combining, market solutions and state solutions and a bunch of stuff together to figure out what works.
And I don't disagree with that. And kind of my position on libertarianism as a whole is, like I said, I want to see this work. I want to see this put into practice. And so I understand that in order to get people elected into office, in order to maybe one day have a libertarian president, I know, don't laugh at me, I know it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but in order to even to change hearts and minds, like, you have to understand that there does have to be pragmatism here, and that there does have to be answers to how you handle certain pragmatic situations. Like, it's one thing to have philosophy, but then, like, how do you put that into practice? Like, okay, you have situation X. How are you going to handle situation X? Like.
Mm-hmm. And you're describing mostly an incrementalist versus kind of revolutionary approach.
Well, because I think if you're going to bring more people into your personal philosophy or your political philosophy, which I would like to do, you kind of have to do that. You can't just throw people into the deep end. Like, you kind of have to, like, walk them through. Like, you start over here at the kiddie pool, and then we're going to go over to the big people pool, and then we'll go over into the 3 feet section, and eventually we'll get to the part where your feet touch the bottom and your head's not above water anymore. But yeah, you gotta kind of do it in a way that doesn't scare the living shit out of people when you first approach them with it. And so, well, I mean, I try to explain this to people. Like, you have to meet people where they're at, and not everybody is where we are at. Some people are still very wedded to the idea that government does certain things and that they should do certain things. And so you got to kind of meet them at slowly weaning them off of that idea, not just be like, okay, well, you have to go reject the state right now, and you've not even really given any thought to anything along those lines. And I think that is kind of a place where libertarianism can do a bit better.
Sounds good to me.
I mean, I try. And I try to understand that everybody is at where they're at, and try to be nice and gentle and kind in trying to gently nurture them along. And I tend to also be a very big tent kind of person. Like, I'm not, my purity test is very, 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 very small, and that's not something I could say for a lot of libertarians. But I mean, if you want to grow your movement, you have to be kind and gentle to the people who aren't already there. And you have to understand that you're not preaching to the converted if you're trying to go out and reach out to new people. And I think, like I said, that neoliberalism could be a good tool to kind of be a transition to where we're at, to where you want to be, to where I want to be. And if people want to get off in different train stations, that's cool too. But I think that neoliberalism, at least as things stand right now in our current environment, is a nice kind of like introduction to libertarianism.
Well, I definitely wouldn't call it that way. I would probably reverse it and say that libertarianism is the nice home for a lot of future neoliberals, but I'm sure we'll just agree to disagree there.
Well, I'll take that instead of libertarianism being the home to a bunch of future alt-righters.
Well, hopefully not, but so I'm getting a signal. I've only got a few more minutes, so
okay. So this would be the part where go ahead and plug your stuff.
So if you're listening to this on Jen's channel, I also host the Neoliberal Podcast. You can check that out wherever you get your podcasts. So if you're interested, please take a look.
And if you are listening to this on the Neoliberal Podcast, my name is Jen from Monroe. It's Jen the Libertarian. You can find me pretty much any place that you find podcasts. And you can also find me on Twitter. If you look under Jen Monroe, you will be able to find me.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Jen.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks. Well, thanks. Yeah, this is kind of a dual joint thing here. So, yes, thank you for being here. So that was my conversation with Jeremiah from the Neoliberal Project. I really enjoyed it. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to it, and I hope that you can take something away from it, if nothing else than actually being able to figure out what exactly a neoliberal is, now that we can have an actual functional definition of the term and of the political philosophy, and how, you know, we're not the same, but we're not completely dissimilar either. So, as always, if you did make it this far, thank you for listening. And if you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and Libertarian Institute. And I do also have a Patreon page now, which link I will put in the show notes. If you're interested in becoming a subscriber, you do get early access to my podcast episodes. So there is that. So, as always, thank you. Take care, and until next time.